Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted that we've got a respectable audience this evening, and that friends and family and people connected with the St. Peter's and people who have got a connection that have got no idea what it is. I'm just delighted that you're here and interested in the history of the town. So let me introduce myself. I'm Graham Ward. Yes, I was born in Northampton, but I moved away in 1985. I'm not a professional historian. I'm not an archaeologist. I've spent most of my working life in IT project management, but I've always had an interest in history and in Northampton in particular. I can actually remember the very first time I visited St. Peter's in the early 1970s. I was at school in Northampton and I was given a school history project, and rather unimaginatively, I called it Northampton Past and Present. But it only had one section, and that was Northampton Past. And I zipped around the town taking a few photographs, and that was my first insight into this marvelous building. The second point I'd just like to mention, I had a school friend in those days. We used to go off on our bikes in the summer holidays, church crawling, as it's known now, around the county by bicycle. And I'm indebted to that friend for introducing me to someone called Nicholas Pevsner and his Buildings of England series, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. An extremely useful book that for Northamptonshire has been revised several times, and can thoroughly recommend it. I do have a wider interest in church history. In the past, I've been a member of a Congregational Methodist, and I'm currently a member of a Baptist church here in Sussex. And I've edited the 1851 Religious Census book for the Northamptonshire Record Society. And I've also published a guide to researching nonconformists for the Northamptonshire Family History Society. So if you like, this is my first foray into the Anglican world. So I hope I haven't made too many mistakes and I don't upset too many people. But tonight we're not talking about St. Peter's. I'm going to be talking about its neighbour, lost if you like. It's St. Gregory. And we'll be spending some time looking at maps to see what traces of this once significant church has left on our townscape. So we start somewhere familiar in Northampton's town centre, just south of Mayfair and to the east of St. Peter's. To quote an oft-used phrase, there's nothing to see here. And in fact, as Gina has hinted, over the recent past, parts of the remains of what was St. Gregory's have actually disappeared before our eyes. But what clues can we see? Well, notice in this area the strange meanderings of the streets in this particular area. Unlike the main thoroughfares like Mayfair and Gold Street, which are very straight and over the past 200 years have been widened and straightened, there's a bit of a clue. When you see these sort of bendy roads, it gives you a clue that you're looking at a much older part of the town. And there's clues in the names too. Notice, of course, St. Peter's Street, which runs along the south side of St. Peter's Church. And then, of course, we've got Gregory Street. And that's obviously making reference to the Church of St. Gregory, which sat just to the north of Gregory Street. And the only thing that really is of note in the area at the moment is this car park, which the council has actually chosen to call Mayfair Car Park. But don't let's get carried away. There is no monarch buried underneath this particular car park. And perhaps for the benefit of, well, for all of you really, I thought something that would be useful to do would be to start with a little local drone flight. So courtesy of Google, we're just going to fly around the neighbourhood and give you a bit of a feel of the area that we're actually looking at. So at the moment, we're sitting in the sky somewhere probably just above the start of St. Andrew's Road and just to the east of Northampton's railway station. And circling here, the dual carriage round here is St. Peter's Way. This is the end of Mayfair. We've got St. Peter's here and the old Black Lion complex here, which is currently being refurbished by the CCT. So fasten your seatbelts It's very short, but we're going to fly off from St. Peter's around to the St. Gregory's site. There is no music, there is no commentary. Now, the area we're looking at that's of interest is this little green area that's at the bottom of the screen with the derelict cars parked in it. This is the area of interest where the Church of St. Gregory once stood. Now, I'm actually going to run this video again, and I'm going to pause it at a couple of points just to sort of point out one or two things as we go around. And now you've got your bearings. So I'm going to stop there. So we're looking north at the moment. This is Mayfair here. This is the junction with Gold Street. And this is the area, this is the sort of like the precinct of the church. To give you a rough idea, the church sort of sat in this sort of area here that I'm indicating in the center of the screen. And the area over here, which we'll see a bit later on when we look at some old maps, this for many years was actually gardens for the houses that are sitting up here on Mayfair. And they themselves are actually quite interesting, but I'll come on to that. And probably these gardens were actually part of the church complex. They may well have been part of the churchyard, but now, you know, for many years, probably 100 years, they've had factories, industrial buildings, garages sitting on that site. So there's potentially lots of interest here. So we'll just fly off round to the end of the video. So we're now looking west, back along towards St. Peter's. And we carry on flying round. We're looking south down across the site. This is Freeschool Street. And there we are. So I hope that was useful. Before we dive into St. Gregory's, though, let's have a little bit more about the context of the landscape. It's interesting that St. Gregory was not actually alone. There were quite a number of churches from the medieval period that existed across Northampton, many more than the Anglican churches that remain today, St. Peter's, All Saints, St. Giles and Holy Sepulchre. And I've indicated where some of these other long lost churches were actually located. And here's St. Gregory's down here in the south of the town. This one over here, St. George, was inside the castle. St. Mary is just south of Doddridge Castle Hill United Reformed Church. But all of these sites have all disappeared from the present landscape. It might seem a bit strange to us, but this is not strange. And anybody who's familiar with the City of London, for example, will realize how many churches were typically in a medieval town. So, you know, having a dozen or so is not untypical. And the site of St. Gregory is actually very close. Here's the site of St. Gregory's Church. It's actually very close to the so-called Saxon Palace that was excavated in between 1973 and 1982 in 2 phases. But what is even more interesting is the fact that this particular site actually sits between the 2 churches. Current thinking is that calling this a palace, which was what was thought at the time, is probably a bit of a misnomer. And it's much more likely that this building, this complex of buildings, was a meeting place, a hall of some sort. It's even been suggested it might have had monastic origins. But there is certainly something interesting going on here when you consider that both St. Peter's Church and St. Gregory's Church have origins back into the Saxon period. So this was clearly, you know, a very significant religious community and complex. And there'll be a large number of houses, as been found, dotted around the area. And as I've said, St. Gregory was not just an isolated church or chapel. it had its own parish. But that parish has been lost and it's been absorbed into All Saints. And in fact, it was absorbed into All Saints in 1557, when the parish was the church was formally closed. A likely sort of perambulation around the parish, if we start up in Mayfair, we drop down what's called Freeschool Street, along St. Peter Street, and then down here, down towards the gasworks. I think this is Tanner Street, and then around what I think is Foot Meadow, following the line of the old Saxon defences, back up to Mayfair Gold Street Junction, and then back to where we started. So you'd think quite a small parish, but considering the size of the houses and the density of the housing, there would have been quite a significant number of people living in this particular area. Something of particular interest is the fact that this kink, this piece that's cut out of the parish, why didn't it sort of just go straight round here? Well, this is the area I've just been talking about. This is the area where that Saxon hall has been discovered. And clearly the parish boundary recognises that in some way, and it's been associated with St. Peter's rather than as part of St. Gregory's Church. Now, what the explanation for that is, I don't know, but it's very significant, I think, that the fact that the parish boundary has got this kink in it and takes that into account. So it was obviously pre-existing when the boundary was put in place. The church itself, as St. Gregory, was actually passed over to St. Andrew's Priory in 1111 by Simon de Senlis I. And the first documentary evidence that we have for the St. Gregory Church is actually a deed from St. Andrew's Priory that still exists. It was written by Hugh, who was Bishop of Lincoln, and he was bishop between 1186 and 1200. And he, in this document, confirms that all of the churches of the town, and he names them all, including St. Gregory, were part of the ownership, the property of St. Andrew's Priory. So if you like, St. Andrew's Priory and its church was the mother church for all of the churches within the town. But we would be mistaken in thinking that the church only originated in the 12th century, as excavations have found to the south of Gregory Street, roughly where the car park is, that the church almost certainly had its origins in the Saxon period. And the reason for that is that there are a group of what we call orientated burials. That means burials that have been aligned within a churchyard in an east-west direction, which is a traditional way of laying out burials in a Christian cemetery. And they're just sort of about 15, 20 meters to the south of the site of St. Gregory's Church. And the three burials that have been found, they have radiocarbon dates of 615, 720, and 840. Now that is just so significant because I mentioned the fact that the church is known by the name of St. Gregory. And some of you may have a little bell ring in your head. Who is this St. Gregory? Well, St. Gregory was the Pope. Subsequently, he was the Pope in Rome, who prompted Augustine to come to England, and he was known as the Anglo-Saxon saint. So it's possibly significant that the church has actually been named St. Gregory. But when did that happen? Well, that happened in about 596, 597. And yet one of these burials is as early as 615. So that's only 15 or 20 years after that mission campaign from Rome to England. So something really significant, I think, from a historical perspective and the context of this site. And following the discovery of these Saxon halls and their proximity to St. Peter's, as I've hinted, they suggest they're part of a larger complex. The halls were lying between these two churches. And we know that St. Peter's has origins before the 12th century, because some of the stonework is of Anglo-Saxon origin. And St Gregory itself was demolished well, the last parts were demolished in 1840, and at that time a Norman arcade. So, 12th century stonework was actually found at that particular time. And as I'm hinting here, this alignment of having 2 or 3 buildings, religious buildings, lined in an east-west direction is not unique to Northampton. It occurs in Canterbury. It's been found in Frankfurt, and there are many other places across England and in fact Scotland. Jarrow, Hexham, Whithorn in Dumfries, and possibly Stenning in Sussex have all got a similar pattern of 3 buildings lined up in an east-west direction alignment from this Saxon period. Northampton wasn't a quiet place in medieval England, and in fact in the mid-14th century a group called the Lollards came into prominence, and they were sort of reforming followers of a chap called John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was an academic at Oxford University and famed for his translation of the Bible into English. And these people who supported him, the Lollards, were essentially pre-Reformation movement of dissent. So they fit into my interest in sort of dissenting and nonconformist interest. And they were quite radical at the time because they challenged and disputed the belief in transubstantiation. And they were very keen on translating in the Bible into English, which was not very popular at that time. They were considered heretics, and subsequently, many of their beliefs actually shaped the Reformation. And here we have Northampton at the centre of Lollardy, supported by the town and its mayor. In 1393, a Carmelite friar had joined the Lollards, and a complaint was made to the mayor of Northampton, no less. Quote, "A certain Nicholas Weston, friar Carmelite, apostate, and Lollard, without a license, has been made parish chaplain to the St Gregory's Church at Northampton." Shock horror! You can hear the anger in that statement, can't you? But there's more to St Gregory's. In the centuries before its closure, there were many bequests to the church itself and to an organisation called the Guild of the Holy Rood, which was located in the church. Now, this image that you can see on the screen, which isn't particularly good because it's enlarged from a newspaper photograph, is a picture of a stone crucifix that sat in a wall on the corner of Church Lane in Sheep Street in Northampton, very close to Holy Sepulchre's Church. That particular building was acquired by the council in 1938 and demolished. I'm not sure what's happened to this particular crucifix. It may well be that it's in the archaeological archive somewhere. Perhaps someone can shed some light on that. But I included it because it just gives us a bit of a clue as to what this Guild of the Holy Rood may have been about at St Gregory's Church. It's highly likely there was a similar type of motif built into the fabric of St Gregory's Church. Now, I don't know if I've got any Guardian readers amongst you this evening, but if you read the travel section from the Guardian a couple of weeks ago, there was a bit of a spoiler for my talk this evening. Now, I really don't know how the Guardian newspaper got hold of this story, but tucked away in the travel section, it was about, the article was about towns in England that are not often visited by tourists. And one of the towns that was featured was Northampton. And in the second paragraph was mentioned, and I quote from the Guardian, "A devoted pilgrim bought a rood." Now, a rood is a piece of wood, a rod or a pole, said to be a fragment of the true cross, from near Golgotha, and following instructions from angels, he was to place it in the centre of England, and he stuck it inside the wall of St Gregory's Church, Northampton, and that spot is off Freeschool Street. It is now a car park. So thank you, Guardian newspaper. I'd be interested to know if anybody else did spot that, but I'm intrigued why they sort of picked up on that particular story. This legend actually is quite useful from a historical and an archaeological point of view, because it helps us to sort of build the picture. Now you might say, well, it's only a story, isn't it? You know, well, yes, it is a story, but it does fit in to the historical picture. Let's unpick it a bit. The legend records that the pilgrim arrived in Northampton on a spot where St. Gregory's church was to be built as new. Well, it's quite likely what they were actually doing was building a stone structure, the church that stood there for about 500 years, to replace a timber building that was probably an Anglo-Saxon building that stood there previously. So it would date this legend from sometime in the 10th, 11th, maybe even as late as the 12th century. And we know that construction work took place at that time because the Norman arcade was actually found in 1840. So the legend and the fabric that has been found on the site do actually fit together quite neatly. But as a consequence of this pilgrim visiting the church, and whether it fits your beliefs or not, the church actually became a pilgrimage church with a national reputation. So much so that in 1472, King Edward IV granted a license to found a guild at the church. But by 1538, when St. Andrew's Priory was dissolved, St. Gregory's Church passed into the hands of the king. And the Guild of the Holy Rood was actually closed down sometime about 1547 by Edward VI. He was the successor to one of the successors to Henry VIII. But it happened after the dissolution of the monasteries. So we know that this guild formally existed between 1472 and 1547. Now it's quite likely that the offerings that were given to the church as a consequence of this being a pilgrimage church were quite significant in terms of the income to the parish. So after 1547, there would be a dramatic fall off in the revenue to the church. And it's not surprising that only 8 years later, we find that the church is actually in a ruinous condition and that the lead from the roof and the bells themselves are actually being sold off by the corporation. Nothing changes, does it? Not that I'm suggesting today's council would do anything like that. Now I'm going to try and do a bit of detective work with some historical documents. So these are not historic maps. And what people have done is quite useful. They have read the historical document, the deeds, and the descriptions of the properties, and used them to reconstruct a conjectured map of what the particular area looks like. Now, one particular document that we have is a rental for the property that was owned by the council, the Corporation of Northampton, in 1504. And usefully, we find that the churchyard boundary is defined quite well. And it also mentions a parson's house, which we think was probably in the dogleg corner of St. Gregory's Street. Now, you could ask yourself, now, why was this street this particular shape? I don't know. But the probability is that the shape of the street is defined by the structures that already existed in this particular area. So church to the north, there may have been something else to the south. And we know we've found burials in this area. So it could be there was an early graveyard in this particular area. And here's the assumed boundary of the churchyard. And if you remember from one of my earlier slides, one of the other nearby medieval churches that also disappeared is the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, which was actually on the corner of Mayfair, not Gold Street. This is actually incorrect. It should read Mayfair here. Gold Street doesn't start until we get up to here. And I'm going to zoom in here just a little bit, because these documents, they give us a bit of a clue as to what the structure, the internal structure and arrangement of the church probably was. And it's supported to some extent by the archaeological work that was done in 1990 on this particular site. It wasn't a full archaeological investigation, but it was enough to be able to locate the foundations of St. Gregory's Church. And we know that it comprised of a nave, as you would expect, a chancel. It had a tower, which was at the west end of the collection of buildings, a south aisle, and probably a lady chapel. And it's this area here that's marked in bold. This is the area that remained until recently. So this part here was actually lost. It was demolished at various stages, and I'll go into that in a moment. Now, trying to put this into a bit more context and trying to imagine what St. Gregory's might have looked like. I found this church. It's in the City of London, and it's called St. Andrew's Undershaft. And it's particularly interesting because when I checked out the arrangement, the dimensions of this particular church are very similar to the dimensions of St. Gregory's Church. So it gives us a bit of a feel as to what the church may have actually looked like. Now, there's one or two things that are different. The tower is located in a different position here. The tower is at the end of the south aisle, where in the case of St. Gregory's, the tower was at the end of the nave, and St. Gregory's didn't have a north aisle, so the church ended at this point here. But otherwise, the building is very similar in terms of proportions and original date for this building. So if you can sort of orientate yourself here to the photograph, this is the church as it is today, hemmed in by lots of buildings all around. So this is very much now, St. Gregory's wouldn't have had modern buildings like this around it. It would have had domestic dwellings and St. Gregory's Street winding round the side. But this is the, you're looking at the nave west window here, just here. Here's the tower. There's the tower. This is the north aisle, which in the case of St. Gregory's doesn't exist. So you're looking at a church of this sort of proportion, but moving this tower, if you can imagine it, into this position here, where it's across the road somewhere. So I just hope that sort of gives you a little bit of a flavour. So returning to Gregory's, some interesting things were going on the site. And there is a continuous role of vicars, for example, right from 1235 through to 1532, when it abruptly ends. Now, remember what I said, that the guild was dissolved in 1547. So things took a turn for the worse quite quickly in the middle of the 16th century. And it may well have been loss of income from the guild. It may well have been depopulation of the town for economic factors. And it could have even have been outbreaks of the plague that reduced the population of the town during the mid-14th century. We don't know why, but what happened to St. Gregory's was not unique. Many of the smaller churches across the town started to disappear or had disappeared by that date. And by 1556, so remember, guild disappeared 1547, by 1546, the parish was actually closed. And in 1547, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a fellow called Reginald Pole, agreed that the church, the remains of St. Gregory's Church, would be passed over to the town and used as a grammar school. And the vicarage house, which is probably the house that was directly to the south of the church, was granted for use of the master of the school. Now, it's actually worth reading what's in the deed, because this particular deed that the Archbishop made out passing over the ownership of the church to the town gives us a little bit more flesh to put on the bones of the picture that we're trying to build. So I'm just going to read this. In consequence of your petition, so the town had petitioned the Archbishop, which says that the Church of St. Gregory, which formerly belonged to the monastery of St. Andrew, since during the last 10 years, so that's 1546, 1547 through to 1556 or more, there has been no pastor or divine service by any reason of the dilapidation of the said church, which is not worth repairing. And since someone of the town of Northampton has left part of his inheritance for the use of the schoolmaster to teach the boys of the said town letters and manners, a schoolroom may be built and kept in repair for the use of the said town. And you shall also enclose the cemetery of the said church, which shall belong to the Church of All Saints, and which was used at the time of the plague, and shall erect on it a small chapel or image that will be known as sacred. And that document is dated the 12th of March, 1557. So this document, it includes mention of the graveyard. It may well have been a plague cemetery, but the site was actually in the news in 1902. There's a report in the Northampton Mercury of some bones being found in the area. And in fact, the police got involved because people were carrying off bones, apparently up Gold Street, and taking them off home. Quite what they were going to do with them, I really don't know. But it found its way into the local press in the early 20th century. So from church becomes a school, a free school. And in fact, this particular picture that we've got here is the first image that we've got. Up to this point, we've just been looking at maps. We're going to go back to maps again, but we've actually got an image of the building. This particular drawing was made in 1818, and it's a picture of the school. It's known as the Freeschool. It's drawn from the corner of Freeschool Street and Gregory Street. So if you were sort of turning into the car park, you'd be sort of turning this corner. And roughly on that area that I indicated when we did the drone fly past, it's in the center of that green grassy area. And what you're actually looking at here is this part of the building. This is the school building, if you like, was made out of the south aisle and the lady chapel of the church, but it's largely been rebuilt. But there are some clues, just looking at the fabric of this building, that it did have a former life, because you notice this pointed window here has actually been bricked up or infilled with stone, and a square window has been inserted in the center of it. But you'll notice that it's off center. So that suggests that the center line for this particular block was not the same as the center line for the building that's standing here today. We're going to see a bit more of this building in a moment. Now, this little extension here, the two-story extension to the south, was added at a later date. Apparently the ground floor was a room for the school usher, and the upstairs room was the school library. And then tucked across here on the right, you've got the tower of All Saints Church. And this is not another church. This is just a chimney from an adjacent building, one of the buildings just to the north of the St. Gregory's site. And there's obviously some of the boys dotted around out in the schoolyard. So an interesting picture. It gives us, some form and some shape and positioning to the building. So the rest of the church has gone by this date. We think this was probably built towards the end of the 16th, early 17th century. And the rest of the church, the nave would have been here. The tower would have been somewhere sitting here. So you wouldn't have been able to see that particularly well. So you've only got part of the building, but it gives you a flavour of what we're looking at. So let's flip back to a map. Now this particular map, this is Noble and Butlin's map from 1746. So it's 150 years or so later after the church was converted into a school. But you'll see the Freeschool is marked on the map. There's the little southern extension with the usher's room and the library, and it gives you these sort of the overall sort of layout and proportions of the church. So tower, nave and chancel have all disappeared. They would have all been up in this area. But just take note of this little triangular area. This is particularly interesting because that probably indicates this line here is probably the northern boundary of the church premises. And we think probably this area here, some of this area at least, is probably the churchyard, and possibly at the front as well here. But you'll see by 1746, all signs of the parson's house, the rector's house, had disappeared from this corner, and it's been rebuilt in some way. Although there is actually another little property that appeared. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Let's go back. There's another little property appears on this corner here, which appears to be within the precincts of the school. So it is possible that this was actually the master's house on this corner, but we don't know that. So let's move on a little bit further. The next map that we've got that have helped to us is Law's survey from 1847. Bit of misalignment between the streets. I rather think that I keep flipping between the two. In fact, I'm going to put the two up side by side. So here's the map that we were looking at previously. The one on the left is 1746. One on the right is 1847. Now, clearly these streets have not moved. It's quite possible some of the buildings have moved, but there are clearly some inaccuracies either in the survey or in the execution of the drawing. And you'll also notice some of the street names have changed as well. So that's another interesting aspect for someone to explore at some stage. And even in that very small area, there's quite a lot of long lost names that would be worth exploring. So let's stick with 1847. Here's the school building. There's a little southern extension, but it looks like it's actually been extended even further. And the little building on the corner here that was there in 1746 has disappeared. And also notice that things have got rebuilt in Freeschool Street, and the little triangular courtyard here has completely disappeared. And the boundary has been cut back in some way. But again, this was the churchyard area and still not built on. So by the mid-19th century, this was still an open space. Now this is really gets exciting. This particular sketch was drawn in 1822. And it was drawn by a lady called Anne Elizabeth Baker, a lady who I wrote a short biography about a couple of years ago. She was a local botanist and historian, and she was actually the sister of George Baker. And Anne and George, they lived at Hazelrigg House, their fair. So this was right on their doorstep. And Anne Baker obviously came round here in 1822 and created this drawing. And the reason she did this, she was particularly good at drawing. George was the historian and read books about the history of the county, and Anne would make contributions to his books. And this was just one of the sketches that she produced. Now what we're actually looking at, this is the east end of the school building. And isn't it marvelous? You know, it's got a full tracery window, you know, sort of 13th, 14th century window. And it looks pretty intact, doesn't it? But don't let get carried away, because we know this building was actually reconstructed at the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century. So it's quite likely this window was actually moved somewhere else within the building. And most likely it was probably, some of the stonework here was probably the chancel window. which would have been here somewhere. So you're facing west, you're looking at the end of what was the Lady Chapel. These buttresses give a bit of a clue that, we're looking at an original wall here. But this is, 16th, 17th century stonework that has been erected here. But gives us a marvellous insight of what part of the school building actually looked like. But there's more. That drawing was made just before some quite significant changes took place. The building was actually in quite a sorry state. And between 1837 and 1840, a lot of the original building was actually demolished and rebuilt. And this is the rebuilt building, which I think was finished in about 1842. And this is actually a photograph rather than a drawing. Now you'll see there are some similarities to the sketch that we were looking at previously. And you can see here that, there's a clue to where the original roof line was, but the new roof has actually been made considerably lower. The windows have been replaced. They've gone from those flat windows. You see this one here has remained in the extension, but the flat windows at the side of the school building have actually turned into pointed windows. And the window that I pointed out on the west end of the school has completely disappeared. So it looks like that this end wall has been completely rebuilt. But when you actually look at the stonework, you can see that there's ghosts of possibly a doorway here, little patterns of arches in the stonework, and possibly even up here, because we know that window was sort of roughly in that position where I'm sort of outlining here. Whoops, keep doing that, clicking. It's disappeared, but there's obviously a lot gone here. But what I find rather strange is that rather incongruously, the southern extension, they didn't alter at all. And in fact, after the roof was rebuilt, they didn't make any attempt to sort of join up this extension to the main body of the building. So it was really just sort of stuck on the side. Anyway, despite all this work, and no doubt considerable cost, maintenance of this building continued to be a problem for the school. And it actually only survived as a school till 1864, when the decision was made to actually close down the school on this particular site. And the school actually moved into the Corn Exchange on the top of the Market Square, the building that subsequently became the Odeon Cinema. That was originally the Corn Exchange. And the school moved into space within that building. And they remained there for a couple of years. And then a new building was built for them on Abington Square. They seem to have it's rather strange this. They moved to the site that the Deco now stands on, previously the ABC Cinema. Clearly it wasn't a cinema in those days, but it was a proper school building. It was built on that site. And then later on, it became the Northampton Grammar School and subsequently Northampton School for Boys, and moved along to the Billing Road, out onto the Billing Road. Now the site here, despite it being in a bit of a sorry state, it didn't fall down. It was purchased and it was converted into a boot factory. But at that time, quite a lot of the building was actually demolished. Certainly the north side was demolished. That's when the Norman arches, the arcade, were discovered, so that you can't see them in this building, but this picture, but they were on the north side of this building, but there were Norman arches across there. And this east end was also demolished, so that was lost completely. And the building remained pretty much like that, incorporated into a factory building right through until the 1970s. when the site came up for redevelopment and the opportunity arose to do an archaeological investigation, which was conducted in 1990. But no further work was taken up on the site until this year. And what's prompted our interest this year is that this site and the adjacent site actually came back on the market and was put up for auction earlier this year, but didn't achieve its reserve price, so it wasn't sold. And there's subsequently been attempts to sell it privately, and I don't know what the current position is unless somebody else does. Quite happy to sort of pick that up during questions if anybody is able to fill us in on that. So we watch this site with interest, but clearly it has quite a significant history for the town, particularly given the other early Saxon buildings that have been found very close and adjacent. So what about the people? After 1557, they clearly didn't disappear. The parish became part of All Saints parish. And so life carried on. Into the 19th century, the Anglican Church felt particular pressure from the nonconformists that were popping up all over the town. And All Saints in particular was under a lot of pressure from what was Commercial Street Congregational Chapel, just to the south of St. Gregory's site. And All Saints decided what they needed to do was open up a mission room. So there was a bit of a rebirth, a short rebirth here. In the 1880s, a mission room was built on this site. Initially, they rented a room on the Green, which is just south of St. Peter's, and then they had this purpose-built building. But things worked quite well for a few years, and the local paper records Easter services, Christmas celebrations. Seemed to be quite a lot going on. And then 1890, the venture completely disappears from the local press. And in the early 1890s, 1891, 1892, to my surprise, I find that this same building is being used by Commercial Street Congregational Chapel. They were actually renting it from All Saints Parish and using it for pretty much the same purpose as a mission outreach for the people that lived in this particular area. But that too was a short-lived venture, and this mission building, was finally sold off again in 1901. But the press reports of the auction show that it was still clearly in the ownership of All Saints Parish. Now, this map's particularly interesting because I've been talking about the mission room, but you can see here clearly this is the outline of the south aisle and the Lady Chapel of St. Gregory's Church. And you can see this garden that I keep, drawing to your attention. It really is a garden and looks to me very much like, a graveyard of some sort. But you can see here that, the rest of the area has all been encroached on by housing. So you've got housing and industrial premises all sort of intermingled. And that's not the end of our St. Gregory's story. This is Goad's insurance plan from 1899. You see here, it clearly marks garden. There's the building, there's the boot factory, Paintman's Boot Factory. And there's Mr. W. Heap. He actually takes over this premises at some. He was a builder, but some of the older residents of the town will be aware that Mr. Heap was a haulage firm and warehousing type business across the town. So he had an interest in this particular site at some stage. Sadly, we haven't got any mapping for this area here, but you see here, it's all been infilled with lots of housing. So people have been living in this area for thousands of years, well, 1,000 years. Now, there's one document that I skipped over. I probably could have touched on earlier. It's dated 1586. And it too, it's a deed, and it describes the area around the schoolhouse. So this is only a few years after the school was actually started, and it describes the gardens and the owners of the gardens. So you've got William Sanderson's garden and his trees, his pear trees and his apple trees and his nut tree and his cherry tree. And then you've got John Ainsworth, and then William Sanderson's got some more trees up here. And what I wanted to point out was there's also in this particular document, it talks about a house of 5 bays at the top of the site. So clearly these gardens here were allocated to these particular houses at the top. And notice this little gap at the side. This is clearly the entrance into this particular area. Now, what does it look like today? Well, this is a photograph taken from Mayfair, and this gap between these two buildings here, between Andrews and Mayflower, is actually this gap here on the 1586 survey. So it still exists on the ground. These are not the same buildings, I hasten to add, that appeared in the 1586 survey, but the buildings are actually a ghost of the buildings that actually stood there previously. And what's particularly fascinating, I think, this is described on this survey as a 5-terraced house, 5-bay house. And if you count these premises here, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sorry to labour the point, but it's the same 5 properties. Okay, these are, Victorian domestic properties, but this is the block that we're actually talking about. So behind these premises, you would have had these gardens that part of it would have been the churchyard for St. Gregory's Church. So I find this particularly interesting, how you can look at today's landscape and see how something from 500,000 years ago has an impact on the street scene and the layout of the buildings and the funny kinks that we have in the road that we see today. I'm just going to sort of wrap up now with a bit of a summary and just show you some pictures, some more recent pictures of the site. I mentioned that an archaeological survey had been done in 1990. There are some pictures from that, but I haven't got particularly high quality views of those that would be good to demonstrate. But it's quite clear that there's been a lot of damage and deterioration that's occurred in the last sort of 20 or 30 years. And I'm very grateful to Mary Pilkington. I think she's on this session this evening, because she's done a lot of the groundwork for me in taking these photographs. So thank you, Mary, for that, as I live 100 miles away. So let's just have a look through these pictures, because they just give us a bit of a flavour. So where are we? We're looking north here. This is Mayfair behind Seoul Central in Mayfair, and you can see bits of early stonework. Now, again, don't get carried away by the stones. These stones here have been heavily reused. They've been, the church building has been knocked down sometime probably about 1550, 1560. The school was knocked down in 1840. The premises were converted into industrial premises. So stonework was around on the site, and it's been repurposed. So where they stand today, a lot of it is not their original positions. But yeah, there's still quite a bit around on the site. And there's even more below ground that we know from the 1990 excavation. Evidence from the layout of the church, we've been able to sort of piece together from the few documentary sources that exist and a few archaeological remains that have been found. And we know that the church comprised of a nave, a chancel, a lady chapel, a tower. It had bells, because the bells are mentioned being carried away. And the nave had a rood and a rood loft. The section that was converted to the Freeschool had large windows at both ends, the east end and the west end. The east end window was probably significantly larger. It had at least one arcade of Norman arches, and according to the historian Bridges, it had a holy water place too, with an arch or a monument of some person above it, probably a saint or someone, sitting on a little bracket sticking out of the wall on the west wall. The positioning of the arcade on the north side of the school, which was discovered in 1840, does indicate that the church extended northwards. And the balance of evidence suggests that the school site was the south aisle and included the Lady Chapel. Trying to put together the detailed dates and the phasing of construction is very difficult given the evidence that we actually have. But I think that actually there is potential to explore what is below the 12th century remains that still sit there today. We've found Saxon remains all around this site, and clearly this site would not have been left in isolation and left alone. It was very much part of the community. I think I've got one more picture that I haven't. Yeah, one more picture. So what are these stones today? What about the stones around the site? Clearly many have been repurposed and not sitting in their original places. And some have actually moved even further. Some have moved to St. Gregory's Roman Catholic Church, which sits in Park Avenue North. And this may be a surprise to you. This church was opened in 1954. And when it was opened, as part of the dedication ceremonies, they included some stones from the original St. Gregory's site. One of the team from the new church went down into the basement of the old building and scavenged some stones with permission. And they were placed underneath the altar in the new church. And it's all recorded in the local press from 1954. And in fact, if you go and look at St. Gregory's website today, it tells you the story. The sad twist of this story is that the stones have actually gone astray. At some stage during some reorganization, relayout within the new St. Gregory's Church, the stones have been moved and they can't be located. So maybe if there is some future redevelopment of our St. Gregory's site, then there'll be the opportunity to recover a few more stones and reincorporate them into the living community of St. Gregory the Great's Church. So there we have it. That's the story of St. Gregory in Northampton. I hope you found that interesting. It's a brief tour. If you'd like to support the work of the Church's Conservation Trust, of which we are very much part, you can do that through their website. And we'd be really pleased if you're not a member of Friends of St. Peter's. You'd be most welcome to join us. We charge a nominal £10 for the year, which I think is fantastic value. And 50% of that we pass back to the Church's Conservation Trust. So you're helping two organisations. So you help us provide all these heritage activities, and you also help the CCT. So thank you for taking time to listen to me this evening, and I hope you found it interesting.